Hey guys, welcome to another video. Now in the last video I spoke about my 3-month trip and just how much money I spent on that trip, and as I promised, in this video I'll give you some tips and some tricks that you can use, or maybe that I should have used, to make my trip much cheaper. So people often say that traveling is expensive and it's just for people that have money to waste. Those are the people that actually go traveling, and that's why many people think, okay, traveling is not for me because I don't have a lot of money. But the fact is, it depends a lot on how you travel, and there are many different ways that you can go about traveling, and depending on how you go about it, then you can actually save money or you can spend more money. I was able to save money on this trip because I didn't pack a lot of things. So I was traveling for 3 months and I only had like 2 bags. Traveling light was definitely a way that I could save money because I didn't have to be concerned about, okay, I'm going to fly to this place, now I need to pay extra money for luggage. No, that wasn't the case. So most of the flights that I took, it was actually included, or even if I needed to pay extra for my actual carry-on, it wasn't that bad in comparison to if I'd had like a big check bag or something like that. It doesn't only save money, it also allows you to save some peace of mind because you have less to worry about. I mean, the less you bring along with you, the less you need to worry about, okay, how am I going to transport this from here to there? Where am I going to store it? And what if it gets stolen? On all those different things. So it reduces the stress, not just in terms of the money, but in terms of the time, the energy it takes to get it around. Before getting on the trip, another thing that I would always recommend to have is health insurance. For the past 2 or 3 years, I've had health insurance, also travel health insurance. When you're overseas and if there's some problem and you need to go to the doctor, and especially in some of these countries where healthcare is so expensive, you don't want to go there and then the only thing you're thinking about is like, yeah, I'm gonna have to pay a lot of money for this thing. And that definitely saved me some money on this trip because it was like 400 euros for my medical bill. And I didn't have to worry too much about that because I'm like, okay, I would pay for it with my credit card and I'll be guaranteed to get that money back. And from my experience on this trip, I got sick at least 5 times or so. So health insurance, don't forget that. Now, one of the first things that I would recommend and that I should have probably done on this trip was to spend more time researching, spend more time asking questions, talking to, for example, receptionists or other travelers about, what they did and the best way to go about doing it. Because there were so many times where I actually fell into these tourist traps where, you see an offer, the first offer you see and you're like, And then a day later or even after you've booked it, then you're like, wow. I definitely recommend spend some time, if it is talking to the receptionist, just asking questions. What are some good deals? Where can I go? What can I do while I'm here? Because that could actually save you some money. If I had done that, for example, when I was in Peru, I paid, I think it was like $100 for this 1-day tour. And when I came back to the hotel and the receptionist was like, hey, where did you go today? I was like, yeah, I did this tour and whatever stuff. It's like, how much did you pay? It was like 100. He's like, yeah, if you had booked with us, then you could have paid like $30 for the very same trip. And I was like, yeah, cool. The topic of asking around and shopping around. When you get to a country and you're like, okay, I just got into this country and I want to make sure that everything goes smoothly. So for example, at the airport, you might be considering, okay, let me get a SIM card right here. Or let me exchange some money right at the airport. There were times where that was definitely not a good idea, especially when I was in Brazil. I wanted to change some money and I went to the Cambio and I looked at the exchange rates and I'm like, what? They were like ridiculous. Like that was like probably one of the biggest rip-offs I've ever seen. Things like these, you might want to look around. Okay, make sure you also know what the rates are. And so there are many apps out there you can download and you can check so you actually know what you should be getting. Because if you don't know what these rates are and you go there and you're like, oh, okay, everybody else is doing it, not true. And especially at an airport, yeah, that might not be the best place to find the best deal. So maybe wait until you get into the city center, which was my experience, as I mentioned, especially in Brazil and so many other countries. When I travel, I usually prefer to pay with card. The ultimate mystery with cash is that it just goes away really quickly. and you just don't have any idea where it went, what you paid for, and all those different things. Paying with card is a really good way to actually manage, okay, where and to know where you're spending your money. At the same time, you're also guaranteed to get more or less a stable rate. So when you go to a country and then you exchange your money, you might lose some money based on the exchange rate, but then paying with card, more or less, it's like a stable rate. You don't necessarily have to worry so much about getting ripped off by a bad rate, because comparing the rates that my MasterCard was using to the actual rates in some of these countries, the rate with the MasterCard was much better. One problem that I had a number of times, well, it wasn't a problem, it was more like a mistake, multiple times, was that I was stuck with certain currencies. Leaving the countries, especially within Central America, most of these countries are left with the land borders. So leaving these countries, and then you have this currency and you need to get the new currency, you're like, okay, I don't like the rate that they have. Maybe I'll try to get a better rate when I get to the city. That wasn't always a good idea, because especially with Honduras, that even now I still have some money from Honduras, because I left Honduras and I thought, okay, the rate at the border was not that great, so I will wait. Everywhere that I tried to exchange the money, it was like, yeah, no, we don't exchange that, because the exchange rate is like really bad. And some of them that did exchange it, they're like, okay, if you exchange that, then you're actually going to be losing a lot of money. Certain currencies, especially if the exchange rate isn't that great, you might want to get rid of those, or try to get as little of those currency as possible, so that you don't get stuck with it. Because if you get stuck with it, then your money is in another currency, and yeah, there's no way for you to actually get it back, or get it back at a good rate, unless you go back to the country. So this is a very basic tip, and you might think it's understandable, but when you're traveling, when you're on the go, you kind of forget to read stuff. Where it's like, you think you know, and you book something and you don't even check the conditions, you don't even check, yeah, so many different things. So I suffered a lot because of this, where I would book certain things, or I would be somewhere and I didn't read all of the information that was there. And then what happened was that I maybe spent too much, or I was actually ripped off sometimes. So it's definitely a good idea to read. If there's information there, sometimes it might not even be up to date or something, but read that information. I mean, it's marketing. Like a lot of these tourist companies, like, they show you what they want you to see, and then you kind of need to scroll down to see what else is there. Take the time and do it. It probably will save you a lot of money and a lot of headache if you do that. I'm a very spontaneous traveler, and especially on this trip, I was very spontaneous with the planning, everything, how it was going. It was super spontaneous. And there's a trade-off between being a spontaneous person and being someone that plans everything. Sometimes there's also some amount of money that's associated with it, because if you're spontaneous, then you might sometimes find that you spend much more money because you don't take the time to think, okay, you know, I should really think about this. Will this actually work out? Which again was my situation so many times, where when I was in Brazil, I wanted to go to the Amazon. And I thought, okay, let me just book a flight to go there. And I booked the flight, and I didn't even think about that. Okay, when you're booking the flight, book it with the airline, so that if there are any problems, you can at least get your money back. I didn't do that. I booked it through some cheap portal. And what happened was, in the end, I recognized it would not be a good idea, because I needed to do a PCR test so that I could leave Brazil. And if I'd gone to the Amazon, then the problem is that there aren't any places there that I could actually get the result back quick enough. So I wasted money on that. And if I just maybe spend some time to plan and to think about it carefully, to say that, okay, will this actually work out with a timeline and with a plan that I have in place, then I would have not booked that flight and would have actually saved that money. So I think it's important to balance being spontaneous and the planning aspect of it. I don't think in every situation you need to be like super spontaneous. There's some things you can, you know, take a breath and say, okay, does this really make sense? How much is it gonna cost? And when you start asking these questions and you're like, okay, it doesn't make sense, so let me do something else. So apart from these guidelines and these tips, there are some general things that definitely worked for me on this trip. For example, staying at hostels. Like, that's probably the best way for you to save money, because my motto is I just need somewhere to store my stuff and to get a shower. I don't see the point in spending a lot of money just so I can store my stuff and just so I can get a shower. So I usually go for hostels, and that definitely helped me to save a lot of money, and at the same time it also helped me to meet a lot of people on the trip. Shopping at supermarkets instead of like going to all these restaurants and stuff, that's another way that you can definitely save money. And within Central America, this was probably the best thing. Like, so much options for street food, for example, buying fruits on the street or like these little snacks and so on. I would just pay like maybe 50 cents or so for like a good serving of fruits for breakfast or for even just a snack throughout the day and so on, or some smoothies. Going for those options, for example street food or like just shopping at the supermarket, can definitely, and for me it definitely reduced the expenses, because I didn't eat out that much, and when I did eat out, then it would have been places that weren't too expensive. I mean, there were times I treated myself, but for the most part I tried to keep those prices down. Something else that was useful for me was local transportation. Of course, you usually have taxes in a lot of these countries, and I usually avoid taxis. They tend to be super expensive in comparison to just taking a bus. To drive, for example, 5 kilometers, and I'm supposed to pay like maybe 10 times the amount that I pay with a bus, like that really doesn't make any sense. Getting around public transportation is usually my go-to. Another thing is keeping track of your expenses. Now, you can't, if you want to save money, you need to know what you're spending your money on. And so if you're just on your trip and you're just spending, and in the end you have no idea where you spent this money, then it's not possible for you to get information so that you can actually optimize for the next time. And so that's why I spend a lot of time, and I have this app on my phone where I track all my expenses. So if I spend 1 cent on a candy, I'm going to put that in the app. So with this information, it helps me then at the end of a week, for example, I can look and say, okay, how much money did I spend this week? Where did I spend this money on? Okay, I spent too much maybe on accommodation, maybe too much on food, too much on this particular thing. Knowing what you're spending your money on will definitely help you to actually spend your money. So find an app that can actually store all this information for you, and it will also help you significantly in terms of managing your expenses and even setting budgets. A budget is also very important. If you just go there and you're like, okay, I'm just gonna spend, that's what you'll do. But if you have in your mind, okay, my budget is 50 euros, my budget is 30 euros per day, then you will actually try to manage your expenses much better so that you actually don't exceed this budget too much. These are some of the tips that I use on my trip, and maybe some of the tips that I also should have used on my trip to cut down the expenses. And just to repeat it, like, there are so many ways that you can travel so that you don't have to spend too much money. You just kind of need to find what your style is and find what works for you. I mean, you can find thousands of tips and different tricks that you can apply, but based on how you travel, then you have to find out how to apply those things and how to use those tips. So hopefully the next time you take a trip, and if you take a 3-month trip, I hope you don't have to spend as much as I did, but even if you do, it will definitely be worth it. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.